When I was in high school, there was a guy who claimed he was a demon. I don't feel comfortable even writing his real name, so I'll just call him Patrick. His actual name sounded like something from a Shakespearean play. Patrick was incredibly socially awkward, and his blank, empty stare unsettled even our teachers. He always wore the same gray hoodie every single day, and it reeked like it had never been washed. He was short, average-looking, and always had his hood up. He never took off his sunglasses, even indoors, and eventually the teachers stopped asking him to. Patrick didn't have friends, but he had this strange habit of adopting people. If he liked you, he'd walk up and declare, "You're adopted." That was his way of saying you were part of his circle. It was supposed to make you safe from him or something, at least according to his own cryptic rules. He didn't adopt many people, though. I was one of the few, likely because he had a crush on me. Looking back, it was disturbing, but at the time I just thought he was a troubled kid with a weird imagination. This all happened in Wayne, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. Another girl in my friend group, Gabby, was also adopted by Patrick. His crush on her was much more obvious. One day, my friends and I were hanging out behind our high school on the dugouts. It was me, Gabby, Laura, and Luke. Somehow, the conversation turned to Patrick's crush on Gabby, and we all started joking about it. Gabby was clearly embarrassed, but Laura slipped up and used Patrick's real name instead of the nickname we usually called him. The moment she said it for the third time, Patrick appeared out of nowhere. He climbed on top of the dugout holding a baseball bat. It wasn't terrifying in the usual sense, it was unsettling. He just stood there, staring at us. I nervously waved at him, and he nodded at me before jumping down and walking away. Once we were sure he was gone, we burst into laughter, trying to shake off how creepy the whole thing was. But deep down, I was disturbed. The next incident was even creepier. I was at Laura's house, hanging out in her room. Her parents were home, and we were just chatting when Patrick's name came up again. 3 times between the two of us. About 10 minutes later, we heard the front door slam. Confused, we went downstairs, thinking one of our friends had dropped by. Instead, we found Patrick standing in the living room, talking to Laura's mom. When she asked why he was there, he replied, "I was summoned." Laura's mom, who knew Patrick and pitied him, politely asked him to leave, which he did without a word. Laura and I, however, were horrified. As we walked back upstairs, we realized the pattern. Patrick showed up whenever his name was said 3 times. It was bizarre and ridiculous, but we couldn't explain it any other way. We told our friends about it the next day, and from that point on, we all agreed never to say his name 3 times in a row. Months passed without incident, and I began to think we had overreacted. But then, one day, we were at Johnny's house, hanging out on his back deck. The topic of Patrick came up again. Johnny, who hadn't witnessed the previous incidents, refused to believe our story. To prove how ridiculous it was, he deliberately said Patrick's name 3 times in a single sentence. At first, nothing happened, and we all let out a collective sigh of relief. But then, moments later, Patrick jumped over Johnny's backyard fence. He stood there, staring at us in silence before climbing back over the fence and disappearing. Johnny was furious and accused us of setting him up, but we swore we had nothing to do with it. The mood was ruined, and Johnny sent us all home. The last time I encountered Patrick was the most terrifying. I was home alone one night, a rare occurrence since my parents were usually around. I had invited a boy I was talking to over, and we were hanging out in my room. It was raining lightly outside. Somehow, Patrick's name came up in conversation, and when I explained the whole situation, the guy thought it was hilarious. Despite my begging, he screamed Patrick's name 3 times at the top of his lungs. This time, there was no delay. The rain immediately intensified and lightning flashed outside. I ran to the window, and that's when I saw it. A silhouette standing in my driveway, looking up at my window. I was almost certain it was Patrick. Panicking, I closed the blinds and rushed downstairs to lock all the doors. When I glanced out the front window, he was in my yard, standing completely still. I started screaming, "I'm adopted!" over and over, hoping it would protect me. The guy I was with tried to calm me down, but I was inconsolable. When I looked again, Patrick was gone. The storm continued, but I didn't dare step outside. The next morning, I found something in my backyard that made my blood run cold. It was Patrick's hoodie, wrapped around a few random belongings of mine that I thought I had lost. I didn't call the police. I was too scared. I decided to wait until my parents came home to tell them, but I never had to. Patrick didn't show up at school the next day or ever again. No one knew what happened to him, and no one really asked. As I've gotten older, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe Patrick was just a mentally ill stalker who somehow managed to overhear conversations. But even now, I can't fully explain the things I experienced. The events I'm about to share occurred over 30 years ago, during my early childhood. Some of the details might be a little hazy, but I'll do my best to recount them accurately. I was around 10 years old at the time, and my extended family was enormous. It was nearly impossible for me to remember all their faces, let alone their names. Every family gathering felt like a reunion with strangers who all seemed to know me, thanks to my dad being one of 9 siblings. This meant I had 8 sets of aunts and uncles on his side alone. My grandparents on my dad's side were quite affluent and owned a sprawling beachfront property. The house was so large it could accommodate over 30 people. Because of this, it became the centerpiece of our summers. My parents, who had jobs that allowed them plenty of flexibility, joined my dad's siblings and their families in making the beach house a shared retreat. Rarely did we have the house to ourselves, and I loved it that way. My cousins were closer to me than most of my friends back home, and the place always felt alive. Among all my relatives, my favorite was Uncle Joseph. He was the father of my cousin Brandon, though Brandon and I didn't play much together due to his reserved nature. Uncle Joseph, on the other hand, was a source of endless joy. He was funny, kind, and understanding, a perfect combination. As a licensed therapist and psychiatrist, he had a way of making you feel heard, even as a kid. I trusted him deeply and often shared things with him I wouldn't dare tell my parents. That summer, I began experiencing vivid, horrifying nightmares. Each dream was different but equally unsettling. Family members dying, being left completely alone, or other situations that filled me with dread. The details of most of those dreams have thankfully faded from my memory, except for one that still haunts me. It was a false awakening dream where I woke up to an empty house. My parents, siblings, everyone was gone. The dream ended with me sobbing in my room, utterly abandoned. After several nights of this torment, I turned to Uncle Joseph. I was embarrassed to talk to my parents about the dreams, but Uncle Joseph was different. He listened intently, jotting down notes in a little notebook as I spoke. After hearing me out, he suggested that the nightmares might be a reflection of unresolved emotions and encouraged me to do some self-reflection. At 10 years old, I had no idea what that even meant, but I trusted his advice. When the nightmares persisted, I went back to him. This time, he told me he had been thinking about my situation and believed I was subconsciously frustrated with my parents. The idea baffled me. I had always been a well-behaved, loving child, and I adored my parents. But Uncle Joseph was a professional, so I assumed he knew what he was talking about. He suggested I start expressing my frustrations, even if it meant being a little rebellious. I hesitated, but eventually followed his advice. For the next 3 days, I acted out, something entirely out of character for me. My parents noticed immediately and weren't happy about it. Despite my discomfort, I stuck with it, hoping it would end the nightmares. But they only got worse. Desperate, I returned to Uncle Joseph, and he told me there was one last thing we could try. He hesitated to explain further, but eventually told me that my brain was too mature for my body and needed to be set free. I didn't understand what he meant, but the idea terrified me. That night, I braced myself for another nightmare, but something unusual happened. I woke up before it started. As I lay frozen in my bed, I heard a whisper, a voice unmistakably Uncle Joseph's. When I turned, I saw him next to me. I screamed, and he fled the room. I ran to my parents and told them everything, the nightmares, his advice, and what had just happened. My dad stormed into Uncle Joseph's room and confronted him. A fight broke out, and my dad snatched his satchel, which Uncle Joseph always carried. Inside, my dad found disturbing documents, notes on dreams, nightmare-inducing techniques, and printed articles about dream experiments. It was horrifying. Uncle Joseph fled, but the police later discovered even more unsettling things on his computer. I never saw him again. My parents rarely spoke about what happened, at least not in front of me. Looking back, I regret being so naive, but I've come to terms with it. There's nothing I can do to change the past. I'm from Denver, and this happened a few years ago. My friend Mike and I were heading to a dinner party on a snowy Saturday evening. On the way, we decided to stop at a liquor store so we wouldn't show up empty-handed. It was an annoying detour, especially with the snow coming down, but we grabbed some local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey before heading back to the car. The snow started picking up around then, though nothing we couldn't handle. Mike realized he'd forgotten to buy a pack of Zins, his latest nicotine obsession, and ran back inside to grab them. I remember being annoyed, especially since I was the one driving, and my car wasn't exactly the best for snowy conditions. After a few minutes, he came back, hopped in the car, and we were back on our way. The snow was heavier now, blanketing the roads and turning what should have been a simple 20 to 30-minute drive through suburban neighborhoods into a tense journey. I'm not the best driver to begin with, and the car, slipping every few seconds, didn't help. As we drove uphill and rounded a corner, we came upon a sight no one wants to see. A car stopped in the middle of the road, its hazard lights flashing. Both the driver's and passenger's doors were wide open, cutting eerie streaks through the falling snow. I wanted to just drive around it and keep going, but Mike insisted we stop. I'm not your typical Good Samaritan. I've dealt with enough nonsense in my life to make me cautious around strangers. But Mike's voice had a genuine edge of concern. Reluctantly, I pulled over and we sat in silence for a moment, staring at the car. Mike asked if we should check it out. I told him that's exactly what we were doing, from the safety of our car. He rolled his eyes and said that watching wasn't going to solve anything. He wasn't wrong, but I really didn't want to get out. I convinced him to wait a few more minutes, and he reluctantly agreed. We watched the hazards blink against the snowy backdrop, the scene beautiful but unnerving. Nothing happened, though the unease only grew. Eventually, Mike had enough and decided to investigate. Before I could stop him, he got out of the car and walked toward the vehicle. I watched with growing apprehension, my heart racing. Out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape shifting in the snow. It could have been my imagination, but the situation felt worse with every passing second. Then I thought I saw the car jolt slightly, as if something or someone was in the trunk or back seat. Whether it was real or my mind playing tricks, I wasn't about to take any chances. I slammed on the horn, startling Mike, who quickly looked up from inspecting the car. He understood my warning and sprinted back to our vehicle. As soon as he got in, I drove off. explaining my suspicion that it might have been a trap. Mike wasn't thrilled with my lack of evidence, but couldn't argue with my reasoning. I wasn't going to risk my life for someone who could call for help if they truly needed it. The rest of the drive was tense. Mike isn't one to let things go easily, but we eventually arrived at the party. Hours passed, and we'd nearly forgotten about the incident while enjoying dinner and catching up with old friends. Later, our host turned on the TV for a weather update, but what we saw chilled us to the bone. A local news report detailed a carjacking that had occurred just a couple of hours earlier. According to the victim's account, she and her teenage son had stopped to check on a car with its hazards flashing and doors open. As they approached, two men jumped out from behind a snowbank, while another emerged from the trunk. The men held them at gunpoint, stole their car, and sped off, leaving the trapped vehicle behind. Mike and I exchanged a horrified glance. That could have been us. We told the rest of the party what had happened, which dampened the mood a bit, though people were fascinated by the story. The experience left me shaken, and even more distrusting of strangers than I already was. I often wonder how many people I might have helped in moments of need if it weren't for that night.